Legacy thinking won't work in today's market, Dan. We need fresh blood, not outdated approaches. The words hung in the air of Marcus Kane's corner office as I stared at the severance agreement on his mahogany desk. 12 years of 60-hour weeks, reduced to a signature and a dismissive comment from a 38-year-old MBA who'd been CEO for exactly 8 months. I'm Daniel Richardson, 52 years old, and until 3 minutes ago, I was Senior Systems Architect at Titan Defense Systems here in Austin. Former Air Force captain with 7 years active duty, then 18 years in defense contracting, and apparently now unemployed because some Wharton grad thinks experience equals baggage. I appreciate the opportunity, Marcus, I said, standing up and maintaining the same composure I'd learned during my deployment in Kosovo. Marcus didn't even look up from his laptop, his perfectly styled hair catching the Texas sunlight streaming through those floor-to-ceiling windows that got installed after our latest Pentagon contract came through. $15 million to upgrade the cybersecurity systems I'd designed from the ground up. Systems that had been protecting critical infrastructure for 8 years without a single breach. Not bad for legacy thinking. I walked through the office, past workstations where engineers were debugging code I'd written during countless late nights. Code that formed the backbone of our entire defense platform. The custom encryption protocols I'd developed during my transition from military service, back when old Mr. Patterson ran things and treated us like family instead of line items on a spreadsheet. "Heading out early, Dan," called Ryan Mitchell from his desk, one of the younger engineers I'd been mentoring. Kid had no idea what just happened. Good thing, too. Ryan was sharp, reminded me of myself when I first got out of the Air Force, hungry to prove that military guys could handle civilian tech. "Something like that," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Military training never really leaves you." I packed my personal items quickly. A photo of Sarah and the kids at last year's company picnic, my Air Force service plaque from the 86th Communications Squadron, and a coffee mug from my old unit that said, "Global Reach, Global Power." 12 years, and my personal effects fit into a cardboard box. I'd given everything else to this company, to the mission of keeping our network secure against threats most people couldn't even imagine. Standing by the elevator, something occurred to me that should have been obvious sooner. Marcus's comment about legacy thinking wasn't just insulting, it was strategically stupid. Every line of code in our defense systems had my fingerprints on it. The documentation followed my personal protocols developed during my time handling classified communications for USAF. Security notes that only made sense to someone with my clearance level and military background. I'd been meaning to create comprehensive handover guides for years, but there was always another urgent deadline from the Pentagon, another system upgrade that couldn't wait. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside. As they closed, I caught one last glimpse of the office that had been my second home since Sarah and I moved to Austin. A thought hit me then. They really had no idea what they'd just done. I wasn't angry yet, just that cold, calculating feeling I used to get during mission planning. Suddenly very aware of the precise location of every system architecture document, security protocol, and government correspondence that had my name on it. Growing up in a military family teaches you about documenting everything. My father spent 30 years in the Navy, retiring as a Master Chief, and he learned the hard way that institutional memory walks out the door with the people who built it. "Keep your after-action reports, son," he used to say over dinner at whatever base we were stationed. "You never know when you'll need to prove what you did." Here I was, walking away from Titan Defense with nothing but a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement that I'd carefully reviewed before signing. The NDA covered company secrets and classified information, but it didn't cover my personal documentation processes or the files I'd already forwarded to my attorney 4 weeks ago when I first sensed this was coming. The signs had been there, closed-door meetings I wasn't invited to, whispers about modernizing leadership, the way Marcus had started bringing in his consulting buddies from McKinsey to assess operational efficiency. Most telling was when he hired Troy Stevens as strategic technology advisor, some hotshot from Silicon Valley who'd never held a security clearance in his life but had an MIT degree and spoke fluent venture capital. I wasn't paranoid. 25 years in the military and defense contracting teaches you to read the signs. When leadership starts talking about agility and disruption in the same sentence as legacy systems, somebody's about to get disrupted right out the door. On the drive home through Austin traffic, I called Patricia Torres, my attorney who specialized in defense contractor disputes. Former JAG officer, served 2 tours in Afghanistan before transitioning to civilian practice. We'd met through the local Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter, where I'd been treasurer for the past 6 years. "I've been dismissed," I said simply, merging onto Mopac. "They're bringing in someone with a more modern approach." "I see," Pat replied, her voice carrying that same steady tone I remembered from military briefings. "And the severance package?" 8 months salary, standard NDA, health insurance continuation. Nothing about intellectual property beyond what was in my original employment contract. "Smart man," Pat said, and I could hear her smile through the phone. "The files you sent over last month look solid. Let's meet tomorrow to discuss options. How's Sarah taking it?" That was the question I'd been dreading. Sarah had been through enough military moves and uncertainty. We'd finally found stability in Austin, bought the house in Cedar Park, got the kids settled in good schools. Now this. "Haven't told her yet," I admitted. "Wanted to talk to you first, get a sense of our options." "Understood. But Dan, don't wait too long. She's going to find out anyway, and it's better coming from you." Pat was right, as usual. The next morning, I didn't feel the urge to check my secure work email or the classified systems I'd been monitoring for years. Instead, I slept until 7:30 a.m. for the first time since my Air Force days, made myself a proper breakfast, and sat down with Sarah over coffee to break the news. "They let you go?" Sarah's voice was calm, but I could see her hands tighten around her mug. 22 years of marriage, and she still had that way of staying composed while processing bad news. Military spouse training, I guess. Marcus said they needed fresh blood. Apparently, my approach is too legacy-focused for today's market. Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking out our kitchen window at the backyard where our son Jake had left his lacrosse gear scattered across the lawn. "How much severance?" 8 months, plus health insurance continuation. "We'll be fine financially while I figure out the next move." "And you saw this coming?" I nodded. "Sent documentation to Pat Torres a month ago, just in case." Sarah smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her that morning. Always the Boy Scout. Be prepared. More like, always cover your 6, but same principle. After Sarah left for her job at the school district and Jake headed off to Cedar Park High, I drove to Pat's office feeling strangely optimistic. Maybe it was having the house to myself for the first time in years, or maybe it was the relief of not having to pretend Marcus knew what he was doing. Pat had spread my files across her conference table. System architectures, version control logs, Pentagon correspondence that clearly showed my contributions, and most importantly, proof that I'd developed the core encryption protocols during my transition from military service, before Titan even existed. "You've been thorough," Pat said, reviewing a stack of documents. "Most people don't document like this." "Military training," I replied. "Plus, I learned from watching other guys get screwed over when their companies went public or got acquired." "Smart. So what do you want to do with all this?" she asked, gesturing to the evidence of my 12 years at Titan. I sat down, thinking it through. I wasn't vindictive by nature, hadn't been raised that way, but I had been raised to value duty, proper recognition, and standing up for what's right. Nothing aggressive yet, I decided, but I want to be ready. Pat nodded, understanding perfectly. "They'll come looking for you. Companies like this always do, once they realize what they've lost. Defense contractors especially. They can't afford to have critical systems fail when there's a Pentagon contract on the line." I left Pat's office and decided to grab lunch at my usual spot, a barbecue joint near Lake Travis where a lot of defense contractor folks hung out. Sure enough, I ran into Tommy Walsh from Lockheed and Linda Chen from Raytheon. "Dan, heard you're taking some time off," Tommy said, which was corporate speak for "I heard you got canned, but I'm being polite about it." "Something like that," I replied. Marcus wanted to modernize the team. Linda raised an eyebrow. "With that MIT kid they brought in? Troy something?" "Stevens. Yeah, he's supposedly going to revolutionize our approach to cybersecurity." Tommy laughed. "Good luck with that. Kid's never worked on anything more classified than his college thesis." Word traveled fast in the Austin defense community. By the time I got home, I had 3 missed calls from other contractors and a LinkedIn message from a recruiter in San Antonio, but the most interesting call came 3 weeks later. I was sitting in my home office reviewing job prospects and working on some personal coding projects when my phone rang. Thomas Walsh, Titan's CTO, and one of the few guys from the original team who'd survived Marcus's modernization. Dan, he said, his voice overly friendly in that way that meant he needed something. How have you been? Fine, Tom. What can I do for you? Well, the team's been working on the next Pentagon submission, and they're having some issues with your security protocols. I was hoping you might have time for a quick consultation. I took a slow sip of my coffee, looking out at Sarah's garden where she'd been spending more time since my unemployment gave her someone to have lunch with during her planning periods. I'm not sure that would be appropriate, given the circumstances of my departure, I said carefully. Tom cleared his throat. Look, Dan, we're willing to compensate you for your time. Marcus may have been premature in his decision. Premature. That was one way to put it. The documentation is a bit specialized, Tom continued, and I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. I almost laughed. Specialized was a polite way of saying that my military-grade documentation protocols were incomprehensible to Marcus's new team. I'd documented everything meticulously, yes, but using classification standards and security protocols that made perfect sense to anyone with a DoD background and no sense whatsoever to Silicon Valley consultants. I'm afraid I'm quite busy at the moment, I said. Perhaps Troy and his fresh perspective can figure it out. Dan, please. I wish you all the best, Tom. Really. I ended the call, but my phone buzzed immediately with a text. We can triple your consultation rate. Please reconsider. I set the phone down without replying. Let them figure out what legacy thinking was really worth. That evening, while Sarah and I were grilling burgers in the backyard and Jake was practicing his lacrosse shots against the fence, Ryan Mitchell sent me an email with the subject, "Line, you need to see this." The kid had always been loyal, reminding me of myself when I was starting out, eager to learn, respectful of experience, and smart enough to know when something wasn't right. Dan, it's chaos here. Pentagon's threatening to pull the contract. 3 major system failures this week, including one that compromised the test environment. Marcus is blaming the old code architecture, but everyone knows it's because they can't maintain what you built. Tom's been in emergency meetings all day. The new guy Troy keeps saying we need to rebuild from scratch with modern frameworks, which would take at least 18 months. Thought you should know. Ryan. I forwarded the email to Pat with a simple note. It's starting. Sarah noticed me smiling as I flipped the burgers. Good news? Could be. Looks like my legacy thinking might be more valuable than Marcus thought. Over the next 2 weeks, the calls became more frequent and desperate. First Tom again, then various project managers I'd worked with, then Marcus himself. Each time they offered more money for brief consultations and knowledge transfer sessions. Each time I politely declined while watching Sarah tend to her tomatoes and Jake practice his shooting form against our back fence. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. I was having coffee with Sarah before she left for work when my phone rang. Marcus Kane calling at 7:15 a.m. Dan, we need to talk. This is getting ridiculous. Good morning to you too, Marcus. What can I do for you? You know exactly what you can do. The Pentagon liaison is asking specific questions about system architecture that only you can answer. We're looking at potential contract termination. I glanced at Sarah, who was listening while pretending to read the Austin American-Statesman. She gave me a slight nod, the same look she used to give me when base commanders were being unreasonable. That sounds like a significant challenge, I said. Have you considered that this might be a good opportunity for Troy to demonstrate those modern frameworks he's been advocating? Cut the crap, Dan. You're sabotaging the company. I'm not sabotaging anything, Marcus. I'm simply unavailable for consultation. There's a difference. The silence stretched long enough that I thought he'd hung up. What do you want? He finally asked. I want you to have a great day, Marcus. Really. I ended the call and looked at Sarah, who was smiling into her coffee cup. You're enjoying this, she said. Maybe a little. Is that wrong? After 12 years of 60-hour weeks and missed family dinners? I'd say you're entitled. That afternoon, Pat called with news that changed everything. I just received a formal letter from Titan's legal team, she said. They're claiming you're violating your employment agreement by refusing to assist with systems you developed. Are they now? Gets better. They're also claiming full ownership of all security protocols, including the encryption systems you developed before your employment there. I was quiet for a moment, watching a roadrunner chase something across our yard. Time to show our hand? I think so. I'm sending them our formal notification today. Pat's letter was a masterpiece of legal precision. It informed Titan Defense Systems that Daniel Richardson retained intellectual property rights to security protocols developed prior to and independently of his employment, and that any unauthorized use of said protocols would result in immediate legal action and notification to the Department of Defense regarding potential security compromises. The response was swift and predictable. Marcus called personally within 90 minutes. Dan, this is absurd. You signed an employment contract that clearly states all work product belongs to the company. I'm aware of what I signed, Marcus. But the core encryption protocols were developed during my Air Force service and refined during my transition to civilian work. I have documented proof going back 15 years. You're bluffing. Check your email. Pat just sent over the GitHub repository with timestamps, plus my military service records showing development of these protocols for U.S. communication security. There was dead silence on the line. We should meet, Marcus said finally, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Pat and I arrived at Titan's headquarters to find the parking lot fuller than I'd seen it in years. Word was spreading through the defense contractor community faster than gossip at a military reunion. Inside the conference room, tension filled the air like smoke from a barbecue pit. Around the long table sat the board members, including General Harold Thompson, a retired Pentagon procurement officer who'd been advising Titan since the early days, and 3 major investors. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. Tom looked like he'd been living on coffee and antacids for weeks. Mr. Richardson, thank you for joining us, General Thompson said, rising to greet me with the kind of firm handshake that spoke of shared military experience. And this must be Ms. Torres. That's correct, General, Pat replied smoothly, setting her briefcase on the table with military precision. We're here in good faith, but I should note that we delivered formal notification of retained intellectual property rights to Titan's legal team last week. Marcus's face flushed red. This is completely absurd. You signed an employment contract that clearly states all work product belongs to the company. I'm aware of what I signed, I replied, keeping my voice calm and professional. But the encryption protocols in question were initially developed during my Air Force service for U.S. communications. I have documented proof, including the original repository with military timestamps and classification markings. One of the investors, a silver-haired woman I recognized as Helen Morrison from Austin Capital, leaned forward. Is this true, Marcus? Did you know about this military background? Marcus shifted uncomfortably, loosening his tie. Dan may have mentioned some prior experience, but any substantial development was done on company time with company resources. I opened my laptop and connected it to the conference room display, feeling like I was back in a Pentagon briefing room. With your permission, I'd like to share some evidence. General Thompson nodded, and I pulled up the repository, showing the commit history that clearly dated back to my military service. The classification markings were still visible on some of the older files, along with timestamps that predated my employment at Titan by 3 years. Then I displayed correspondence between Marcus and me from my early days at the company, where I explicitly mentioned adapting my military-developed protocols for civilian defense applications. You'll note, Pat added, that Mr. Kane acknowledged Dan's prior work in these communications, but never formalized any transfer of intellectual property rights beyond the standard employment agreement, which specifically excludes pre-existing work product. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. The board members exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Marcus looked like he wanted to crawl under the conference table. There's more, I continued, pulling up slides from Pentagon presentations. These are materials presented during our contract renewals over the past 8 years. You'll notice the encryption protocols are highlighted as key competitive advantages, but my military background and prior development work are never mentioned. General Thompson removed his glasses, studying the screen with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades evaluating military contracts. Marcus, you represented these as internally developed innovations during our security briefings. I supervised their implementation and integration, Marcus insisted, his voice cracking slightly. Dan may have had some preliminary concepts, but the substantial work was done here. Supervision isn't creation, I countered, feeling the same calm focus I used to get during mission briefings. And your supervision consisted mainly of setting impossible deadlines while taking credit for results in investor presentations. Tom, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. Every eye in the room turned to him. I can confirm that Dan was the principal architect of our entire security framework, Without him, we can't maintain it properly, as the past 6 weeks have clearly demonstrated. Marcus shot Tom a look that could have melted titanium, but the damage was done. The board was now looking at Marcus with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for defense contractors who couldn't deliver on their promises. "What exactly are you seeking here, Mr. Richardson?" asked another board member, a balding man I recognized from previous company meetings. Pat stepped in smoothly. "My client isn't looking to destroy Titan Defense. He believes in the mission he helped build over 12 years. However, he requires proper recognition of his contributions, appropriate compensation for his intellectual property, and guarantees against future misrepresentation of his work." "And if these terms aren't met," Marcus challenged, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Then the notification stands," Pat replied with military precision. "Titan Defense will be legally prevented from using the encryption protocols, effectively rendering your Pentagon contracts void. Additionally, we'll be required to notify DoD security oversight about potential intellectual property violations in classified systems." The reality hit everyone simultaneously. Titan's $15 million contract, their entire defense portfolio, their relationships with Pentagon procurement, everything hung in the balance, and I, the legacy thinker they'd so easily dismissed, now held the key to their survival. The emergency meeting continued for another 4 hours. As more evidence emerged, emails, technical specifications, even performance reviews where Marcus had praised my unique military insights, his position grew weaker by the minute. Around 3 p.m., General Thompson called for a brief recess, during which the board members convened privately in an adjacent conference room. When they returned, the general addressed the room with the authority of someone who'd managed billion-dollar defense programs. "After careful consideration, the board has made several decisions," he announced. "First, we're implementing immediate leadership changes. Marcus, we appreciate your vision in growing the company, but there have been serious misrepresentations under your leadership that threaten our core business relationships." Marcus went pale. "You can't be serious. I've increased revenue by 40% since taking over. With Dan's technology," Helen Morrison added pointedly, "a fact you deliberately concealed from us and, more seriously, from our Pentagon liaisons. Second," the general continued, "we're offering Dan the position of Chief Technology Officer with appropriate equity compensation, backdated stock options, and full recognition for his past contributions." My heart raced. This was more than Pat and I had expected. Additionally, we're proposing a licensing agreement for the encryption protocols with ongoing royalties on all revenue derived from their use, plus a seat on the technical advisory board. Pat and I exchanged glances. This addressed everything we'd hoped for and more. And finally, we're requiring a public correction regarding the development of Titan's core technology, acknowledging Dan's role as the principal architect to be distributed to all current clients and Pentagon liaisons. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is a mistake. You're handing the company over to someone who held it hostage." "No, Marcus," I said quietly. Feeling the weight of 25 years in defense work behind my words, I'm not holding the company hostage. I'm ensuring that the truth is recognized and that our national security commitments are honored properly. General Thompson nodded approvingly. "The board's decision is final. Marcus, you can accept a reduced consulting role focused on business development, or you can leave entirely. The choice is yours." Marcus looked around the table, searching for allies but finding none. Without another word, he stormed out, the door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the conference room windows. In the silence that followed, I realized the satisfaction I felt wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about protecting the mission that had defined my career since my Air Force days. 6 months later, I stood in Titan's main conference room, addressing our expanded team and several Pentagon officials. The company had undergone a remarkable transformation under new leadership. "Today marks an important milestone," I began, looking out at faces that included Ryan Mitchell, now promoted to senior engineer, and several new hires I'd personally recruited from the military to civilian transition community. With the release of our enhanced security platform, we're not just improving functionality. We're rebuilding on a foundation of transparency and collaborative innovation. The encryption protocols that had once been my solitary creation were now maintained by a team of skilled engineers, all receiving proper credit for their contributions. The documentation was comprehensive and accessible, ensuring the company would never again depend on any single person's knowledge. After the presentation, General Thompson approached me, smiling warmly. The Pentagon's impressed with the turnaround. System reliability is up 92%, and we're seeing renewed confidence from allied nations who use our frameworks. It's a team effort, I replied, genuinely proud of what we'd accomplished. True, but your leadership has been the catalyst. By the way, heard Marcus is having trouble with his new venture? I nodded. Word travels fast in our community. I hope he learns from the experience. Some lessons come at a higher cost than others, the general agreed. That evening, driving home through Austin traffic to Sarah and Jake, I reflected on what legacy thinking really meant. It wasn't about being stuck in the past. It was about building something that lasts, something that matters, something worth defending.